So the craziest thing just happened because I was sitting here and I have a ADHD and I had 7 minutes to go before I came on to talk to you. And I got distracted and I started giving my message, or I started talking to you before I was on the air. And I just talked for 7 straight minutes, and I would have gone on for another 20 if I didn't realize, oh, I'm a minute late, so I better get started. So here I am. Thank you for being here. I love this topic today. Those of us who have deconstructed our childhood faith are often accused of being atheists or apostate or heretics. You could call me whatever you want. I don't really care. It doesn't bother me. I've got enough self-esteem to let it roll off my back because I was called names when I was in that faith. you know, so I mean, when I stand outside of it, I don't feel too bad. But in this episode, I want you to walk with me as I actually, I don't give an apology or a defense of things. I just talk to you about things that linger after the smoke is cleared, right? After you sort through the ashes and you see something shiny in there and it persists. After you stand in the river and you dip your pan into the river and you're shaking out soot and gravel, and all of a sudden there's something gleaming left in your pan. That's what we're going to talk about today. So those lingering echoes of what some would say was our former faith. I don't want to talk to you about that as doctrine. I don't want to drag you back into certainty, because this stuff, it's not that. I call it the sacred residue. Because I do believe in the sacred. I still do believe in the sacred. I don't believe we're just material things. Or if we are just material things, I think in that box somewhere, there's room for the sacred, what we call the sacred. Clues, curiosities, questions that still whisper and on some days shout at you. So I'm going to give it to you all up front because I know I might lose some people today. There are some people in their stage of deconstruction who are still going through hurt and anger and bitterness, and they might not want to hear today what I want to talk about as something that still resonates with me, or something that I still hold as valuable. Some people just want to burn the whole thing down, and I understand that. And I beg you, just hear me out. I'm not trying to convince you of everything. I'm just talking to you about my personal journey. It might resonate with some of you. But it's something, there was, for a brief time, a late night TV show host who was friends with Eddie Murphy. Now, his name is going to escape me. But he used to have a segment on his show where he'd say, these are things... I'm going to have to type it in now. He would say, these are things that make you go, huh? The Arsenio Hall. How could I forget Arsenio Hall? Love Arsenio Hall. But anyway, Arsenio Hall used to have a segment on his show, and he'd say, these are things that make you go, That's the show today, folks. These are things that make you go, Now, after deconstruction, some of us feel naked. Some of us feel clothed for the first time. Some of us feel like we walked out of the cave just with soot all over us and our clothes burned off. I get it. Deconstruction, though, comes with a cost. Does it not? I mean, it can take a lot from us. It could take, for some of us, not all of us, but for some of us, it could take our livelihood, our jobs, our position at the university or in the pulpit. For many of us, it takes community. For some of us, it takes family away. It definitely takes away certainty and comfort. It takes away language and familiarity. But there's so many things you get from walking away from ignorance and walking into the truth and into the light. And I think overall it's worth it. I'm going to talk to you about a few things that stayed with me today. But I want to start by saying, let me go back to that. Let me go back to it and just show you, because I am pretty proud of my thumbnails. The sacred residue is what we're going to talk about today. And it starts with a probing question. What if the faith that we walked away from, what if the faith that we left wasn't all there was? And we pretty much know that, right? I mean, most of us could pretty much tell you why we believe that was wrong and that was not true, even if we can't tell you with certainty or even confidence what we do think is true. We kind of know what's not true. We kind of know what's ridiculous. We kind of know what is toxic, what is bad for people to believe. That's what made us uncomfortable while we were in the pew, and that's probably what inspired us to stand up and walk out. All right, so let's talk about this sacred residue. And like I said before, I'm going to give it to you all up front, and then we're going to take it one by one. So, the first mover. Now, some of this we won't have to recover, but I will just say that this is an old philosophical argument. Why does anything exist, right? It gets dry, it gets boring. At best, it might prove a power beyond space and time that had a hand in what we know as reality. Okay. It's not turtles all the way down, right? I watched recently Alex O'Connor, who is otherwise known on YouTube as the Cosmic Skeptic. He is an atheist, and yet recently he did an episode, and he revisited this as from a few years ago. But he did an episode. What was it called? I convinced ChatGPT to believe in God, and this wasn't a joke, and it wasn't. He didn't prompt it. It was a legitimate conversation he had with Chat about the nature of truth, and contingent truth and so forth, and the likelihood that there is a first mover, that there is something that everything else might rest on. Now, this is the logic of a first cause, something timeless, something immaterial, something necessary. It isn't a religious dogma. It is, though, philosophical gravity. Now, there are Christian apologists who begin here, and that's why many people who walk away, or many skeptics or many atheists, try and deny it, because it's an arrow in the apologist's quiver, and they've pretty much shamed themselves in so many ways and proved themselves to be disingenuous and dishonest, that if you grant them this, then in some people's minds, you're opening the door for people to accept them as legitimate voices, when really they aren't. Most of them are clowns. And this is why most of you walked away from it. Most of you wanted to find the good answers, and you wanted to believe these guys were true, and you found them to be straw manning and and in some cases being completely dishonest. So if you grant them this, some people just don't want to grant anything to somebody they're opposing, right? So I understand that. And this isn't even the strongest argument. This isn't something I spend a lot of time thinking about. In this universe, as not only the Apostle Paul brings out in Romans 1, two things that make him believe that there is a power behind the universe is the starry eyes above, so that the tremendous awe he has in the face of creation, right? You look around and it is beautiful and terrible. I mean, if you see an animal devouring another animal, you could see horror and terror. And if you see the aftermath of a tsunami or something like that, I understand that. But there are moments, my wife and I walked out on the terrace this morning and saw dark gray and light gray clouds tinged by pink. It was just extraordinary. And so, I mean, to look at all this and not think that there's an artist behind it, or maybe a scientist behind it, or some kind of creator, does leave you kind of with a blank. And now I'm not trying to prove a God of the gaps thing, but there is a philosophical argument to be made that there's a power behind it. Now, there's a huge leap. I used to ask scientists who believed in God and who believed in Christ, I used to ask, how do you get from the God who created not only the Milky Way galaxy, but the trillions of stars and the billions of orbs and so forth that we see or don't see in the night sky? How do you get from that to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And to be honest with you, I'm going to be completely honest with you, I was never given a good answer. There was never a good answer for that. Because they were trying to mix something that's philosophical and you could kind of understand it, which is a creator of all of this. And they were trying to put him in a pint-sized jar that was a tribal God created by very articulate Jews. Yeah, it's difficult, right? So anyway, this idea of a first mover, why there's something and not nothing, and a million questions that come along with that. It doesn't prove Christianity. It doesn't even prove that there's a God, so to speak, depending on how you define God. It might simply prove that there's a larger power. And some people have said that it's probably the power behind the universe may be an alien grad student who set down the universe like a snow globe on his desk and forgot about it because he only got a C- on it, right, in his science fair project. I think that's diminishing of the wonder and the awe of the universe. I don't think he'd get a C-. But you cannot prove that argument is any weaker than the argument that there's a God who is personable and who loves you and knows the amount of hairs on your head and got you the parking spot at the Kohl's as you pulled up to get some groceries this morning. So yeah, there's just the argument is just as strong that force may not be what we know or what we have defined as God. So I think I've spent enough time there. But if you really want interesting 20 minutes, go spend it with Alex O'Connor as him in chat. Try and sort out if that makes philosophical sense. Sacred residue number 2, and this is the one I'm going to focus on really because this is the inspiration for the next 3. And that is Jesus. So the person of Jesus, whether you see him as a historical figure, which I do and most people do, or you see him as a myth and a legend, it won't matter. So stay with me. So those of you who are rolling your eyes that I brought up Jesus because you don't believe he existed, stay with me because it won't matter. Seriously, it won't matter. My argument about Jesus isn't built on the idea that Jesus must be God. So stay with me. Stay with me on that. So Jesus is number 2. Number 3 might surprise you a little bit. It's 2 figures around the Jesus story. Mary, his mother, and Gamaliel, who was a mentor to the apostle, to Saul of Tarsus, and was a member of the Sanhedrin. So I'm going to speak about those guys and girls relatively shortly. Then I'm going to talk to you about the Bible. Now, don't run away from this, because oftentimes people who go through deconstruction have a problem with the Bible. It's a trigger. It's something that really grates on them, and something they want to hold up like a crucifix in front of it. It's so horrid to them. Or they want to wear a chain of garlic around people who bring up the Bible. I'm not going to be using the Bible as a witness on the stand because of what's written in the Bible, but that the fact that the Bible was written. So stay with me on that one. Some people bring up transformation. I'm going to spend a few minutes here on transformation, but I'm going to be cautious about it, right? Some people say, there's a famous atheist who said, I can disprove anything you bring up to me from the Bible. I can show you that prophecies were written after the fact, or that they're ambiguous in kind of a Nostradamus effect way. So it's a coincidence. I can dispute anything that you bring up from the Bible, but the one thing I can't dispute is my mother's life. So the strongest evidence for a God for that particular atheist was the fact that his mother believed in God, and it made her an angel from heaven. It made her the most wonderful person he ever knew. That's not ground you can stand on philosophically, and there are Hindus, there are people with other faith. There are atheists who had atheist mothers who could say the same thing. So that's dangerous ground to go to, the ground of experience, right? It's because people have had other experiences. As a matter of fact, some people who've grown up in Christian cultures, the greatest people they ever met were people outside the faith. And some of the greatest brutes and bullies that they've known are people within the faith. So terrible things have been done in the name of Christ as well as wonderful things. So this is dangerous ground to grow to, and yet it does not people who've met people who give all the glory to Jesus for their behavior or their temperament and who have changed. Somebody like, Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace, who was a brutal slave captain taking men into slavery and selling them. And then he became a tender heart. And some of us have seen it with men who had beaten their wives, who were alcoholics, and they were able to break free of that lifestyle and that kind of hurt because of a relationship in the faith. And yet we see people of other faiths being able to do the same thing. So this may not prove Jesus or Christianity as much as it proves the idea that the belief in something sacred can give you inspiration and give you encouragement and give you an atmosphere or even a community that lifts you up and that nurtures you to be a better you. And that pretty much is undeniable, right? I don't think you could get into the weeds and say, yeah, but it works for us and it doesn't really work for you guys. It's a charade when it works for you guys. And the scientific evidence behind people believing in faith and it helping them to heal quicker or whatever, or people pray and thinking that that had something to do with them healing and so forth. There is bad evidence of that, and there's also good evidence of that. Like that was it a B-17 bomber that overflew its base because of some equipment that was out on it, and they crashed when they ran out of fuel in Africa. And the men who had a belief system made it further than the other men out of the desert. They all still died. But I mean, there's this kind of evidence of stuff like that. But I don't think that's a great argument. But it does make you go, When you've known somebody who was an absolute train wreck because of the life that came out of the bottle or the needle, and they tell you in no uncertain terms with complete and full and utter belief that if it wasn't for the faith they found in Celebrate Recovery or something, that they'd be dead or in prison. And now they're kind, they're thoughtful, they're loving, and they're helping others. That you can't dismiss that. And I don't care if it's Christian or Muslim or Hindu or what have you. You can't dismiss that, right? It's something. It's true and it's relevant. And it might have something to do with spirituality or kind of a residue that there's something beyond this material world, that there's something beyond and worth living for in this short time we're here. So I'm going to be cautious around transformation and the effect it's had on people's lives, but it's relevant. And it does make you go, And then I want to talk about the inexplicable, which we brought up last week, right? With Carl Sagan in Contact, where the atheist female Jodie Foster talking to the believing Matthew McConaughey about proof and only really believing something that's provable in the Karl Popper kind of a way. And then Makani asks her, do you love your father? And she says, of course I do. And he says, prove it. And she's stumped, right? Because that's something you can't really prove, but you know it's true, right? So anyway, there are things that kind of stand outside the test tube, right? There's the longing we have in our heart. There is joy. There's transcendence. I know personal sacrifice for greater causes could kind of be blurred with evolutionary psychology, and certainly the argument of the God of the gaps will come into play here. But I also resist the kind of arrogance that comes with pretending that all gaps are just ignorance, where we throw a God label. I do think some gaps are mysterious, and may remain mysterious, and can bring us inspiration, and can make us better. All right, so those are the ones that are around the edges. Those are the periphery. I want to get to the meat of the matter for me. I adore Jesus. I'm one of those people who deconstructed, and there's people that I left behind back in the cave that think I hate Jesus, or that think I hate the Bible, because I just don't accept theirs anymore. Because I don't bow and say the same prayer or sing the same song or sit in the same pew as them anymore. And they don't have a really good response to it because they live in a dichotomous world of black hats and white hats. So I must be one of them. I must be one of the others. I've had people who've known me my whole life say to me, so now you're leading people to hell, or leading people astray, or leading people to the devil, because that's the only jargon or vernacular they understand. It can't compute to them that I still revere and adore Jesus in a different way. So anyway, I'm going to talk to you about Jesus for a moment, but maybe I should bring up the Bible first. Maybe I bring up the Bible first and I end with Jesus. How about we do that? Maybe I go backwards. My point 5 was the Bible. The Bible doesn't prove God, by the way. I know there are people who make you sign a paper if you work at a Christian university, or if you take a job as a pastor, saying that you believe that the Bible is the inerrant, infallible Word of God, which makes the Bible God, right? It does. It makes the Bible the fourth member of the Godhead. It's absolutely ridiculous. And that's developed over time, really, from the 17th, 18th century, but as a response to criticism. So I know there's this idea that the Bible is the Word of God. I'm not making that argument. As a matter of fact, I'd make a counter argument to that. The Bible doesn't prove God to me, but can I make an audacious statement? Listen closely. The Bible doesn't prove God to me, but it does prove Jesus. Ooh, now stay with me, because I'm not going to say it proves everything about Jesus. I'm not going to say it proves Jesus is the Son of God, and God became man and raised to the right hand of the Father. I'm not bringing up the Bible because of what's written in it. I'm bringing up the Bible because it was written. And without Jesus, there is no Bible. The Bible did not make Jesus. This is one of the first lessons I give people who go through deconstruction, and the Bible is such a boogeyman. The Bible's such an enemy, because those people in the cave bow down to it like an idol. And you're at a place right now that it's not an idol. And there's passages in the Bible that are atrocious, and that couldn't be the word of a living God who's benevolent and worthy of our love. And you're right. You're right. I'm not going there right now. We've gone there in previous weeks, and it's gotten people to say of me that I must hate the Bible. I don't hate the Bible. I just don't think it's God, and I don't revere it in that way. It's not an idol to me. But the fact that the Bible exists, to me, proves Jesus, because the Bible didn't exist before Jesus. It didn't. Now, some people are of the understanding that the Bible came together because Moses came down with the Old Testament from the mountain and Jesus came out of the tomb with the New Testament. That's their simplistic understanding of how the Bible came together, because they've only sat in a Sunday school and they've only heard warped teaching from the pulpit, and they have no idea about how we got our Bible. They don't even realize that the Bible didn't come along for hundreds of years after Jesus. And they don't even realize that the Jewish canon, what we call the Hebrew canon, that testament didn't come together till after the Christian one. That there was a New Testament before there was an Old Testament. Because prior to Jesus, there were sacred scrolls of the Jews, just like there were sacred texts of other communities in the East, or the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or India's sacred texts, and so forth. They were scattered texts celebrated by very few people, known by very few people, and accessible by even fewer. So nobody knew anything about those Hebrew texts prior to Jesus. And the reason people know them today, the reason Hollywood uses a line from the Psalms as a title for a movie, or The Grapes of Wrath becomes a book that uses a passage from the Old Testament. The reason it's so prevalent in not only Western literature, but you walk into the museums of art history and you see it, so many of the famous pieces of art reference the Bible are all because of Jesus, not because of Moses. Nobody even knew about Moses. Prior to Jesus, there wasn't a Bible. Now listen closely. Jesus did inspire a lot of writing. This is one of those things that makes you go, And what we could call the New Testament is the Jesus writings, right? These are writings about Jesus, fitting Jesus into the great puzzle. And those writings spurred on the Jews to put a canon together. When the Christians had one, the Jews are like, oh, we should collect our scriptures and put them together. And so hundreds of years later, those were bound together. But they were still unknown until they were slapped together in one binding with the Jesus teachings. And the Bible became a thing. And then the printing press came along, and these came along, and people became more literate, and they were able to read after 30 years old. And the printing press made it more prevalent, and all of a sudden, the Bible that Jesus inspired became the best-selling book of all time. So I'm not pointing to chapter and verse, and I'm not talking to you about doctrines in the Bible. I'm talking to you about the fact that the Bible exists today is Jesus. Without Jesus, there's no New Testament. Without the New Testament, there's no Old Testament. Without the New Testament and Old Testament bound together, there's no Bible. So, the best-selling book of all time is because of Jesus, period. Not Moses, Jesus. The Jews had no intention of proselytizing or having missionary movements. None. It still isn't in their in their capacity as a people of faith, right? So Jesus created the Bible. The Bible didn't create Jesus, even though there are texts in what we know as the Bible that predate Jesus. So that's just one argument. The fact of the Bible doesn't prove God, but it proves Jesus mattered. And then the fact that a bunch of illiterate people who didn't care about writing began a flurry of writing because of Jesus. Now, you might think Jesus is a myth. Very few people in the world, and very few academics, even fewer academics, believe Jesus was a myth. Most people believe Jesus existed. They believe at least that, and they believe he was killed at the hands of the Romans, and he was hated by his own people, pushed into the murderous hands of the Romans. We kind of all agree on that. What happens after that is blurry. Did he rise from the dead after the third day? Was he the Son of God? Is he seated at the right hand of the Father? All of that is dogma and doctrine. But most people believe that he existed. Now, I'm going to talk to the people who don't. Let's say you don't believe Jesus existed. Let's say you believe it was just a legend or a myth. Okay. All right. Let's pretend there was a St. Nicholas, but there was never a Santa Claus. Let's pretend there was somebody there that inspired this legend of Jesus, or maybe a few people. Maybe it was 4 or 5 people. I don't care. What I'm telling you is without that figure, without that icon, without that legend or myth, there wouldn't be a Bible. And something about that legend or myth at the time made a bunch of illiterate people really busy about writing this myth down. Even the Gospels that aren't included in the Bible. He became a celebrity, which is strange. And it makes you go, because to believe the skeptics at the time, whether they were Jewish or Greek, he was the product of a Roman rape of a Jewish handmaiden. Unimportant people in the whole Kardashian scope of the first century. So how did this happen? How did a crucified carpenter lead to this? Lead to Christmas Break? Right? How did it lead to all those songs? All that artwork? Okay, it makes you go, There might be material reasons you're going to argue for it. But to me, it is kind of miraculous. If you want to take the lowest common denominator, believing that Mary was raped by by a Roman centurion, and the product of that, and then a bunch of lies grew up around this, and a bunch of illiterate Jews got a bunch of literate Greeks to write it down. I don't know. That sounds pretty crazy. It's interesting. It's enough to make you go, So the fact that the Bible exists doesn't prove God, but to me it proves Jesus. The world's most influential book, for good or bad, was born because of Jesus. All right, so that's the writings. Now let's look at 2 people mentioned in the writings. One is Mary, and one is Gamaliel. Should we start with Gamaliel? Let's start with Gamaliel. If you went to Sunday school, you know about Gamaliel. He was a wise Jewish rabbi. He tutored exclusive students. It came, from what we know, at a great cost. To be in the school of Gamaliel, you would have had to have memorized the Tanakh or the 5 books of Moses. You not just had the finger tabs. You'd have to have those memorized to even sit in his school. It was thought that you had to be wealthy, that you had to buy your way in as well. It was the most exclusive school for rabbis in all of Jerusalem at the time, which is not long after Christ. But there's one point I want to drag you to, and it has nothing to do with Paul. It has to do with 2 of the apostles that were dragged before the Sanhedrin not long after Jesus died. And they wanted to do the same thing to these guys. They wanted to see him on a cross. They wanted them to be stoned to death, or what have you. They were causing trouble in Jerusalem. They were getting people to go after their story that they were telling about Jesus. And the Sanhedrin brought them before to be judged. And it probably would have gone bad if it wasn't for Gamaliel, who was, by the way, well-respected. He was a well-respected member of the Sanhedrin, like a tribal chieftain. And he stood up and he said, wait a minute, before you pick up your stones, before you drag these guys to the Romans, let's talk about this for a second. We've all seen this before. Let's not be historically ignorant. We've seen this with a guy named Theudas. We've seen this with Judah. We've seen this with other people who claimed to be the Messiah, who had a popular following, and then died or was killed. And we've seen what happened afterwards. A week goes by, 2 weeks, a few months go by, and the movement dies with him. The movement stays in the tomb with the dead guy, with the dead claims, with the false claims. So what's known as Gamaliel's argument, or Gamaliel's rule, or Gamaliel's law, became prevalent. He said, so consider this. If this movement, early Christianity, is not of God, it'll die with the carpenter. This is what he said from the Sanhedrin. If this movement is not of God, if it doesn't have God's divine hand or divine breath breathing into it, it's going to die. It's a fad. we don't need to be alarmed by it. It'll die of its own inertia. But in the small chance, and it was a small chance that he was positing here, in the very small chance, in the possibility, not even the probability, in the possibility that this is God's hand, that this is God's breath, that this is something of God, do we really want to be standing in the way of it? Do we want to be hindering it? Do we want to be chastising it? Do we want to be persecuting it? This was Gamaliel's argument. It won out. I mean, they ended up, I think, beating him and releasing them, but they didn't kill him. Gamaliel's argument, though, if you consider it, if it's not of God, it's going to die. It didn't die. Now, you might not believe it's a strong argument, but it kind of seems to work in every other case, right? In a lot of cases, Gamaliel's argument has historical precedent. That doesn't prove Jesus. It doesn't prove the things that are said about Jesus. It just makes you go, Now, Gamaliel's argument is interesting, but there's something larger than this. Now, I told you I wasn't going to talk to you about what's written in the Bible, but on this case, I guess I lied. I have to. There's a passage in the Gospels that has Mary making an audacious claim. Mary actually says, and you know it because you probably sang it in choir at some point, maybe even in school, but most probably in church, that all generations henceforward would call her blessed. All generations would call her blessed. Now I want you to think about this. Let's pretend Mary's a handmaiden, a Jewish handmaiden, and she was raped by a Roman centurion, or what have you. She got pregnant out of wedlock, which is what materialists would argue. And she gave birth to Jesus. Okay. Maybe she's completely delusional. Maybe in response to not giving the victory to the Roman brute who had his way with her, maybe this is her way of saying, screw all of you, I gave birth to the Messiah. Maybe this was some kind of psychological self-defense for her. But the fact that an illiterate, backwater, hillbilly Jew, or maybe just a creative storyteller, all right, skeptics, you still with me? Unbelievers, skeptics, atheists, people who don't think the Bible has anything in it worthy of notion. Let's say just a creative Greek, literate Greek, made this story up. He's got a character in this story that says, from henceforth, every generation will call me blessed. And it's a prophecy that came true. And it's a prophecy that you can't backdate. You can't say, well, it was written after the fact, because it's still coming true today. Somebody burns their toast and they think they see a vision of Mary in it. There's an oil slick under an overpass in Brazil, and thousands of people now start flocking there because in it they think they see a silhouette of the Madonna and her child. You have a Beatle writing a song, a pop song, that was in honor of his dead mother, whose name was Mary. Paul McCartney's Let It Be, and Catholics all around the world think he wrote a song about the mother of Mary. And they revere the song thinking it's written about Jesus's mom and not Paul's. You get everybody knows Jesus's mom. Do you know Buddha's mom? Do you know the name of President Trump's mother? Everybody knows the mother of Jesus. And that makes you go, Now, I want you to consider one thing, and I've got a longer thing on this, but just one thing. Let's consider one famous woman from the first century. And I might get some of the facts wrong or twisted, and it's not Cleopatra. Some people, if you ask them who was the most famous person in the first century, they'll say Cleopatra. No, she was a Kardashian, and it was fleeting. And she didn't have a lot of power, and she didn't have it for very long. She was a bauble to be passed around by Romans. I'm not trying to diminish her. She was a child of fate. She she made the most with what she had, and she was brilliant in many ways and charming in many ways. But she wasn't the most powerful or the most famous person in the first century. The most powerful and the most famous woman in the first century has been forgotten in history. And we know Mary, and we know Cleopatra. We know Cleopatra because of the sex, because she was able to turn Romans against Romans, because she was able to seduce not only Caesar but Mark Antony, because we really know Cleopatra today because of Shakespeare, to be honest. All right. But let's go back to the one we don't know. Her name was Julia. She was a daughter of the most revered and celebrated Roman general, apart from Julius Caesar and Scipio Africanus. So she was the daughter of Germanicus. She was the niece of a Roman emperor. She was the wife of a Roman emperor, and she was the mother to the Roman emperor Nero, and the sister to the Roman emperor Caligula. And for a while, to be honest with you, early in her son's tenure, she was the Roman emperor. And then finally, he got jealous of her pulling strings, and he had her killed, Nero. Her name was Julia Agrippina, and she was the most powerful and most famous woman of the first century. And no one knows the name of Nero's mother unless you're a historian. No one knows the name, right, of Claudius's niece and wife unless you're a historian. No one knows the name of Caligula's sister or Germanicus's daughter unless you're a historian, or like me, an armchair historian. So why do we know Mary and we don't know Julia? It makes you go, It does. And it's not something that can be thrown out. It's not something that you could say, oh, Daniel was written hundreds of years after. And no, this is one thing that makes you go, and it all centers around Jesus. And listen, I know people that can't stand Jesus, mostly because of the church, mostly because of Christians and what's been done in his name and the ugliness that has been portrayed in his name, the homophobia, the sexism, the patriarchal nature, the kind of control and manipulation of people groups. I get it. I get why that would be ugly. If your forefathers, if your ancestors were meant to bow and kiss a sword, a crusader's sword, or die, and they chose to die rather than to say Jesus is Lord, how would you feel? If the Jesus people during the Reich were the ones hunting Jews down, how would you feel? Okay, all right. But if you look at Jesus, just look at the legend. Just look at the myth of Jesus. You can't help but fall in love. It's like watching the movie Zorro and not cheering for him. It's like watching Robin Hood and not cheering for him. Or Batman and not cheering for him. Jesus was a superhero. Jesus stood up to power. He stood up in the teeth of maybe the greatest power of the ancient world and said, no, you move, like Captain America. I'm not a big fan of Captain America, but I want the Jesus action figure. I want the guy who stood up in the face of ugliness and brutality and said, no, we can be better than this. He grew up in a Jewish system where the N-word was Samaritan. It was the S-word. The Samaritan was, to paraphrase a John Lennon song, and I'm not going to say the N-word, but the Samaritans were the N-word of the Jewish world. They were hated. They were despised. They were lied about as not being fully human. And Jesus makes the Samaritans the heroes of his stories to confront the blatant racism that he grew up in. And it made him enemies. You know who else was hated in that world he grew up in? Tax collectors, Jewish people who had betrayed their own people to collect taxes for the Romans. Hated. In some places, they were killed by the Sicarii, knifed in the marketplace. They were on lists, folks, and Jesus broke bread with them like Zacchaeus. Jesus sat with them. He lifted them up. He even called one to follow him, Matthew. In a world that despised women, in a world that, listen, I love Greeks and I love Plato, but in Plato's world, in that Greek world, women were less than slaves. They were esteemed less than slaves. They were considered just to be breeders, like farm animals. In that world, Jesus gave esteem to women. In that world, both Roman and Jewish. Jesus stood up for women, much to the confounding even of his own followers, who at times were outraged of his treatment of women. I love that guy. I wish we had somebody like that today, who in the face of Trumpism was standing up for the outcast groups. I wish that we had Christians that followed Christ's examples, who would say this is outrageous, what is taking place in America today. What is happening to the LGBTQ, what's happening to the other groups and the outsiders in the name of Christ today is disgusting to me when we see what Christ meant and what Christ did. And so, yeah, Jesus is somebody who makes me go, And that doesn't necessarily elevate Jesus to the level of the Son of God or the right hand of the Father. It doesn't even necessarily say he rose from the dead. I'm willing to sit with the atheist and the skeptic and just look at the life of Christ that we find in the Gospels and look at the words and his actions. And I'm big enough to say I can't resonate with everything, but the biggest picture makes me think, yeah, that's a hero. That's somebody who should be celebrated. That, and the fact that he inspired the Bible and these other things I put together, it does make me go, And it's still in my pan when I pick it up out of the river. And there are other things, but I think that's enough for today. So I leave you with this. What's on your list? And maybe we have some crossover from me to you. Maybe some of the things I mentioned resonate with you, or maybe they just started to because you hadn't thought of them before. Maybe you're still going through the pain of healing, and so you don't even want to think about the Bible or about Jesus. I get it. You don't have to. Heal. Maybe, I hope that this show is part of the process. Even if we never talk, even if you never drop me a message, I hope that my words are health-giving, are life-giving, are soothing to you, are helping you heal, are letting you know that the road that we're on, even though we might be in different places, and we might end up in different places, for the time that we're walking together, I love you, I appreciate your company, and I'm better for having walked with you. And I hope to leave people better for having walked with me. So what would your list look like? And maybe your list is going to change over the years. That's all right. Keep it in your journal and see what happens. Maybe you're going to cross out some things, or maybe you're going to add some things. But today, right now, do you even have a list of things that still bring up a longing in you, that takes you beyond your senses, or definitions, or formulas, or equal signs? What stayed with you, or what might be coming to you on this journey, on this path? Might not even be something that stayed with you. It might be something that surprises you around the next corner. Something that a fellow traveler says they find relevant or interesting. So share this with someone who's wrestling with what lingers or with what might be worth ruminating or allowing to marinate in your mind. And with that, I say adieu. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you. We'll see you next week. Oh. If I press the right button, we will.